However, we are able to pick up those points of building tension up. They have building tension around March to basically mid-May of this year, around November to January, November of 2012 to January of 2013. And then it really just sort of ramps right up from there until May of 2013. Those 3 periods are quite distinct within that entity. So we have the assumption, because of the growth of the sun disease stuff, that there's a big connection there.
Okay. And then you were saying that we're going to be reacting to the sun like we're all on a drug trip. And so what are the symptoms we need to recognize and say, oh, that's part of the trip? And
that's going to be really a good question, because it's the whole area within Space Scope Farts entity where a lot of the sun disease affecting individual human minds and the human collective, a lot of that data is within the unknown and the officially denied sets. So when you look at that data, it is a maddening puzzle, very much like a nearly completed jigsaw puzzle where someone has deliberately removed handfuls of the text or of the puzzle here and there, such you're not really quite sure what the picture is. And basically what we do is we have a whole string of words that are saying, some people are going to be drooling and stop standing in the middle of sidewalks. That'll be one of the big images coming out. We're fairly sure that'll be so repetitious that maybe a significant portion of the population will react with that set of symptoms. Those kind of symptoms will basically be a short circuit of the brain. And so those individuals, it would be as though they were made insensate in the context of you could talk to them, but you could not be sure that they were actually hearing you. So the sensory apparatus of their brain is such that it had basically shut down, and they were on autopilot, just sort of standing there quivering, that sort of deal. We know that will be one set of circumstances that will exist, but at the same time, we also have data suggesting there will be people that will be aware enough to help these other individuals. And then the symptoms get a little bit more vague, and we'll be going to the idea of everything from a seizure, a brief, like a seizure of maybe 2 or 3 eye blinks, where you're not even really sure you had that seizure, but you're just not quite right, and it was a sudden sort of a fleeting thing. We have a lot of language towards that, and then we have a lot of language that shades from that sort of an abrupt, sharp edge event all the way down to a general fogginess of the ability to think. You're sitting there with the keys in your hand, looking at them, and you're not sure if you really are standing in front of the front door trying to open it, or if you're sitting in your car trying to use the keys to turn the car on, but you're pretty sure you needed those keys. That's the kind of descriptions we're getting for the range of effects on those. Some of these may be able to be mitigated. There was just some suggestion within the Space Goat Farts entity that indeed those things were being mitigated by natural surroundings. So we have, to continue on just a bit, we had language suggesting, for instance, that file clerks and prisoners would be less affected than airline pilots and people who do traffic safety, due to strictly to solar exposure and the amount of either paper or cement between you and the sun.
Oh, that's interesting. So it sounds like we just really need to be patient with ourselves and patient with each other.
And very much so collectively as well, yeah.
Yeah.
Because the patient with each other, we're going to be frustrated individually, and as a rule, humans don't we're not self-critical, and we don't really sit on top of our emotions. They're usually not our servants, they're our masters. And so when people become frustrated, I expect that we'll see a whole lot of outbreak of very irrational behavior. Now, the good side of this was once pointed out by Igor, who's a very paranoid kind of a fellow. He was laughing once and reading some of our base language in some of my notes. And he said, well, maybe the good part is that everybody will find themselves all of a sudden living in a Groucho Marx movie. And in other words, we'll slip right into insanity so quick that we won't have a time to really settle into the frustration and duke it out because we don't understand what's going on mode. And he's got something. There's something to that. There's a whole category of minds, the collective mind within, in a general sense, within the military that is used to dealing with, and even in that sense, corrections and prisons and so forth, that's dealing with the hierarchy and so on, just won't know how to cope. And so maybe they'll just slide right into drooling stage, or, oh, well, let's screw it. I don't understand what's going on. Let's just go off fishing until everything sorts itself out.
Yeah, let's all just go fishing. So, well, I think Plain has our next question.
Hey, Cliff. So what's your view of the sun? Is it just a big comet? Can we name it Bot's Comet?
I think it is indeed cometary, but I don't think we need to name it thus, because that would imply that comets are somehow special. And I think that's the model for universe. I've been really noodling on this a lot. And I've looked at a lot of math that is associated with the idea of string theory and dark matter and dark energy. And at the moment, because my mind is so loosely connected, it takes me a long time to organize it and get it all well made up. But at the moment, I'm of the opinion, it's my conclusion, that the sun is probably a living entity in a way that we are alive. And that further, as a living entity, it's probably, I don't know if we could say with intent, but it is in motion. And that motion, I do not think, is through a vacuum. And part of this opinion is, that part anyway, is shared by some of the Russian and other astrophysicists that are really looking at what it is involved in the coma around the sun and what that implies. So my conclusions are loose at the moment, but I'm pretty sure that Bott is far more right than anybody is willing to give him credit for. And a lot of his work is now, you'll find it duplicated in a lot of the Russian conclusions, because they're also of the same opinion. They're also of the opinion that the moon has never orbited Earth the way Earth has never orbited the sun, and that to a certain extent the kind of tectonic disturbances we have on our planet are due to us dragging the moon behind us, in a sense, as we are dragged behind the sun. But there's now pretty sure evidence that, in fact, at two disparate sections of astrophysics, we now have solid evidence that Bott's model is correct. One of them is continually reported, and that is that the NASA Voyager spacecraft are not leaving our solar system. They are slowing down, as Bott's model would suggest. Now, you have to understand that Bott's model says that the sun is basically a big comet going through interstellar space and dragging all of the planets behind it. And that from our perspective, we can't tell we're behind it. We think we're at the equilateral, or at the equatorial plane of the sun for some reasons that were foisted on us in the Middle Ages, but that can be clearly proved to be spurious. And that being inside the coma of this giant comet, anything inside that coma, in order to leave the coma and go into interstellar space, would have to satisfy certain conditions. One of those conditions would be it would have to obtain an escape velocity relative to the mass that is at the slice that it has of the entire ecliptic plane of that solar system. So basically it's stating this: in order for the Voyager spacecraft to leave our solar system, to exit through the coma, it has to have more energy, or it has to have the amount of energy required to escape the entire slice of mass of its width that would go through our entire solar system at that point. And so basically the Voyager spacecraft, if it's the size of a Volkswagen Bug, is trying to drag an ever-expanding cone of the solar system, the size of initiating at the size of a Volkswagen Bug, but reaching to the entire width of our solar system. It has to have enough energy to escape that mass, very similar to the escape velocity required to get off our planet. And further, the other condition is that it would have to have a harmonically determined spin in order to spin its way out of the rotation that we're involved in. Okay, so that being the case, Voyager is never going to leave our solar system. It'll just hang back there by the edge of the coma, way back at the back of the tail, and be drug along just like all of the other debris that's on the other side of Neptune and Pluto. Now, there's been another development relative to BOT, and it's being reported within the Russians, but I've also had confirmation both from academic astrophysicists and from some black ops guys who were kind enough to send me some emails. And what they did was they took and I'd made this comment in one of my noodles about the sun and Dr. Bot's solar system that said that if his suppositions were true, that we were being dragged behind a giant comet that is our sun, then one thing that would be obvious is that Halley's Comet and all these other little tiny comets, Hale-Bopp and all of these guys, were also part of our solar system and never, ever, ever went into interstellar space. They just disappeared from our view for some determined period of time and came back and hassled us again. And so I mentioned that we would have to examine our thinking about these things called periodic comets. And I got a bunch of emails from astrophysicists who have been doing just that apparently for a number of years. And they've come up with some very interesting information that confirms Bot's model. And here's some of the thinking. The thinking is that if the comets were truly extra stellar, that is, that they went between left our star system, left our solar system, then certain conditions could never exist. And one of those conditions is that the periodic comets themselves could never form conjunctions with fixed stars because they would be exiting our solar system, and they would exit such that the angle of incidence of their leaving would disallow them to have a conjunction. I would have to explain parallax and a bunch of other stuff to you that really isn't pertinent. But basically, they discovered that that is indeed the case. Rather, the opposite of that is the case. They have found that the periodic comets, and the Russians sent me a list of 18 of them that they had noted, that the periodic comets that all conjunct certain stars. An American astronomer sent me one that said he found 3 comets that conjunct Algol. And then there were 5 that were conjunct Al-Niktak in Orion, in Orion's belt. So this means that all of these periodic comets never leave our solar system. They're as bound to our solar system as ourself. Well, so Dr. Bott's model suggests then certain ways, to my way of thinking, certain things that are perhaps also true. And that is, in order for the coma to exist, the sun must be burning its way through by way of friction, by way of force, through some interstellar media that is not vacuum. This brings up the issue of parallax again. All of our suppositions about space are based on us looking out from Earth, basically between Earth and the Moon, and Earth and Venus, and Earth and Mars, and even Earth and the Sun. But what if all of those observations are based on looking at our local environment, such that here we are sitting in our local little village, and I look over to your house, which is across the street, and I see the street and the skylights and everything there, or the street lights and the grass and your garage and car and so on in a developed and urban sense. And I look down the road and I see another such house and so on, and everything is just fine. And that's because we're looking towards each other, and we all see this same view. And when I call you up in your house, and your house is Mars and I'm on Earth, I say, hey, what's your view over there? And you say, well, I see a street light, and some grass and a couple of cars and stuff. And we can't see the air between us, but we know it's there because we're breathing it. And we know that sound exists because it goes between our 2 houses when we yell at each other when we're both drunk. And so we know all these things exist, and this is how we determine our reality. But what if all those things only exist between the houses, because the houses are all surrounded by a larger mega environment, which is the coma of the sun? And what if we were able to look outside that coma? Would we see that indeed there is even air out there, or in this case, vacuum? What if it were to be solid? We wouldn't know, for instance, what the local environment was unless we could look outside and stop looking across at each other and attempted to see, turn ourselves around and look directly behind ourselves.